welcome everyone. Good to see you all here. Do let us know where you're from in the chat box. We've got Trevor Clements here today from Hertfordshire Building Control, and he's a lifelong learner and he likes to share his knowledge. And today he's going to be talking about approved document O on overheating. If you've got any questions, do let us know in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we'll answer the Q&A at the end of the session. Over to you, Trevor.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, Rachel Liggett there, our marketing executive in the control box, and she'll be muting all the hecklers if we get any, but hopefully we won't. Yeah, I'm training and development principal at Hertfordshire Building Control, and welcome to another of our CPD webinars. Fantastic to see the interest this one has generated. We've got, I think, a record audience today, and not surprising because Part O has got quite major ramifications for people who are involved in the design of new dwellings. So thanks for the lifelong learner bit as well, Rachel. That's very nice. A lifelong learner, actually, but there you go. We won't talk about that. So approved document O and requirement O1, the subject of today's webinar. Recent evidence shows that there's a growing problem with overheating in residential buildings. That's caused by the high proportions of glazing and inadequate ventilation to cope with solar gain in the summer months. And that, of course, results in health issues, things like stress, anxiety, sleep deprivation, and even sometimes early deaths in heat waves that we get more and more frequently, don't we? And that, of course, will especially affect more vulnerable residents of buildings. So I read that the Committee on Climate Change has forecasted that rising temperatures will lead to mortality rates rising from 2,000 per annum to 7,000 by 2050. And that, of course, isn't helped by the focus on energy conservation, which is resulting in highly insulated airtight buildings. As we know, the Future Home Standard is looming in 2025, and we're seeing the introduction of higher standards in the new approved document L. So riding in on the back of that approved document and approved document F on ventilation, we've got this all new document, part O, with requirement O1 being added to Schedule 1 of the building regulations. And the approved document will come into force not long now on the 15th of June 2022. So it's definitely need to know information. So this is a slide showing the subjects I'm going to cover today. The actual requirement itself, the scope of the requirement, the two compliance methods that can be adopted to demonstrate that the design complies with the new regulations. We'll cover interactions with other requirements in the building regulations and touch on Regulation 40B, which relates to the information necessary for owners of buildings. And I'll conclude by talking you through the transitional provisions for those of you who aren't already aware of those. So here is the requirement, requirement O1. I'll read it to you, clause 1. Reasonable provision must be made in respect of a dwelling, institution, or any other building containing one or more rooms for residential purposes other than a room in a hotel to A, limit unwanted solar gains in the summer, and B, to provide an adequate means to remove heat from the indoor environment. So it's all about protecting the health of the occupants of in-scope buildings. Firstly, by limiting the unwanted solar gain, and after that, then by providing an adequate means of removing any excess heat during the summer months. You notice that phrase, rooms for residential purposes. I know the audience is made up of a lot of building control people who will know what that means, but for those of you who don't, that doesn't relate to houses or flats, although they are, of course, covered by the requirements. It's rooms used to live or sleep in, such as a hostel or a boarding house or a hall of residence or a residential home, maybe. That it doesn't include hospitals, just maybe a nursing home or something like that, or a retirement home. So after that clause, we've got clause 2, and that says that in meeting the obligations in para 1, account must be taken of the safety of any occupant and their reasonable enjoyment of the residence, and B, that mechanical cooling may only be used where insufficient heat is capable of being removed from the indoor environment without it. So yes, we must take account of the occupant's safety and enjoyment of the residence, more on that later. And also that any mechanical cooling must only be a last resort. We have to explore all the potential for passive measures to be taken where they're viable. We don't really want air conditioning units to be built in either with or subsequently, which are going to be chugging away and creating the carbon emissions that Part L is trying its best to minimise. So the scope, and you'll see on the right there, that just you probably can gather from what I've already said what the scope is, but read it again. Dwelling houses, new flats, residential and institutional buildings, such as care homes, other residential buildings, such as halls of residence, residential colleges, student accommodation, boarding schools, and children's homes. We do still have a few of those, I believe. So I should also tell you that shared rooms in multi-occupancy buildings, such as maybe a care home where you've got a common room or something like that, they are also covered within the scope of the requirements. And of course, there's an obvious question here for many of you that are involved with designing extensions as well as new dwellings. What about extensions? Are they covered in these new requirements? That was not clear initially. As building control colleagues will know, when we look at building regulations, we have to take the term building to also mean a part of a building. That's actually stated in the regs. And unlike in any other approved document that's come in recently, there weren't any stated limits on the application. So we were left wondering, with no clarification at the time, as to whether extensions would be controlled. I'm glad to be able to tell you that after talking to some knowledgeable colleagues with good contacts in the government at HBC headquarters, I can formally tell you that Part O does not apply to extensions or changes of use. So a lot of you breathe a sigh of relief there. Thank goodness for that. So yeah, you'll still be able to put in your lantern roof lights and your big bifold doors that everybody wants, and you're not going to come unstuck on overheating. Maybe on Part L, but not on Part O. So if you do have to comply, then there are 2 ways to demonstrate compliance, and these are called the simplified method and the dynamic thermal assessment method. So firstly, the simplified method, there it is for you as a process. Initially, you categorize the building as a high risk or moderate risk. That's easy to do. High risk just means, is it in central London? I'll show you more about that later. Secondly, you categorize the building as either cross-ventilated or not cross-ventilated. And by that, I mean ventilation on 2 opposing sides. So you won't find many flats that are cross-ventilated. Even a corner flat would not be vented on 2 opposing sides. So you have to stipulate which. And then, as in 3, you use tables that are in the approved document and the relevant ones to find, firstly, the maximum area of glazing that you can have in the building or the part of the building, and then you apply that maximum to the whole dwelling calculation, and then you apply it to the most glazed room. Following on from that, you use a relevant table to find the minimum total free area of ventilation openings, and you apply that to the whole dwelling, so how you remove that excess heat. And then you also apply that minimum area for bedrooms, and you apply it to all bedrooms. So there's the simplified method in a nutshell. There is a default provision for providing shading for buildings in high-risk location. So we're right in Hertfordshire and the home counties, but if you're in central London, you will have to incorporate some form of shading where the building elevation, the glazed elevation, most glazed elevation is facing between northeast and northwest via the south. So that's a large proportion of the compass that would be relevant to. And if you do need shading, then there are several options that you see there. You can have shutters that have a means of ventilation built into them. And I should stress that's external shutters, not internal. You can incorporate low G value glazing. The maximum rating would be 0.4. In other words, only 40% of the solar energy is transmitted through the glass into the room. So that's another option, which I'm sure will be one of the popular ones. It does mean I think you get a bit less light transmittance as well, but there's a trade-off. And finally, you can build or design in overhangs into the building, and an overhang should have a 50-degree altitude cutoff to be regarded as effective to provide shading. So that was for the high-risk locations. So there you are. Here's some of the tables in the regulations for limiting the solar gains, so the maximum areas of glazing. That's table 1.1, and you'll see that that relates to buildings or parts with cross ventilation. So you'll base the assessment on the facade of the building with the largest area of glazing, whether that's north, south, east, and west. And I would suggest that it's the facade, it's the closest you can get to north, south, east, or west from the facade's alignment. And once you've done that, then you can check, depending on whether it's a high-risk location or a moderate-risk location, you can then check the maximum area of glazing to the whole building in relation to the floor area. And then you would check the most glazed room in the building. As it says in the table earlier, it's in the building or part of the building. So in multi-occupancy buildings, then each residential unit would be separately checked in this way. Just a few definitions. Floor area, probably reasonably obvious, but it is the internal face of the perimeter walls. And the glazing area, less obvious, is the actual area of transparent material. So that doesn't include the frame. So it just makes it a little bit more complicated when you're tallying up your numbers to work out the glazed proportion of the window. Whoever said it would be easy, eh? So table 1.2 is about limiting solar gains for buildings or parts without cross ventilation. So as I said earlier, that'd be the majority of flats. You'll notice there that certainly for moderate risk location, there's not a lot of difference there on the maximum area for the whole building, but it's a little bit more onerous on the area for the most glazed room. So just a bit more restricted there in those numbers. So yeah, that was for buildings without cross ventilation. So now we need to calculate the minimum ventilation area, and that is stated as being the minimum free area of ventilation openings. So that might be the for the whole house or flat that you calculate first, but you'll also see there's a column for measuring the areas to bedrooms, so they both have to be calculated separately. So yeah, you'll see this columns for high risk location as before, and the moderate risk, whereby you're looking for 9% of the floor area, total floor area, or 55% of the glazing area, whichever is the greater. And for the bedrooms, you're looking for a maximum of 4% of the total area of the room. That's with cross ventilation, and then there's corresponding numbers for buildings without cross ventilation, where the risk of overheating is a little bit higher. So yeah, the free area, yeah, it takes a bit of calculation, but it looks reasonably simple, doesn't it? You would think so. However, there's this question of Appendix B in the approved document, which has a load of tables for calculating an equivalent area of openings. And I know a few colleagues like me were scratching our heads when we were looking at this and thinking to ourselves, well, so what? What's this about? The tables mention free area. So what's this equivalent area of why do we need to know all these numbers? Well, after some communication with the government, we had a statement put forward, I think a little bit of a red-faced statement, and I think they recognise that there's scope to revise the approved document to make it a lot clearer. And they said that the targets in the tables that must be met are described as free area. However, to use a more realistic value for the openings area and the amount of ventilation it can provide, we expect the equivalent area to be calculated and to meet or exceed the free area value. So unfortunately, not so simple. We have to separately then calculate the equivalent area and apply that. Well, thanks for telling us. We got there in the end. So there you see some tables from Appendix D, which show you how to convert to equivalent areas. And there's various tables depending on the opening angle of the window. And then you relate that to the width and height, and you will get the equivalent area in the table. So if that's a sliding sash window, then you would use the table for 90-degree opening windows, which seems to make sense, doesn't it? And if you've got a top hung window, then you would just reverse the H and W, the height and width, because obviously they'll be opening in from the top. So it's just slightly different calculation. The link below, you'll see that's a calculation tool. If you don't want to go to the trouble of going through all the tables and running the numbers, there is a tool there that was developed for schools and overheating in schools. It's called affectionately the Class Cool calculator. So that's something you can use if you want to. So there we are. It was going so well, and then we've got that complication, but no doubt the energy consultants will be rubbing their hands. The more complicated, the better, I expect a lot of people think. These are the postcodes for the high-risk areas. As I said, it's really central London. It's where you have the urban heat island effect. Lots of concrete, lots of thermal mass absorbing heat and then releasing it in the evenings. Not a lot of trees, not a lot of shading. So we've got this more onerous risk of overheating. So there we are. That's it on postcode, and that's it on a map. Dark green area is for high risk. So the outer London boroughs, some of them are just moderate risk. And nowhere in the country is low risk, apparently. So that keeps it simple, doesn't it? So that was the simplified method. And as I mentioned, there's two, and this is the second one. It's known as dynamic thermal modelling. And it's described in the document you see on the slide, which is SIBSE TM59. And if a designer prefers, they can get a bit more design flexibility by using this dynamic thermal modelling as a method to demonstrate compliance. So yeah, it's quite an established document, 2017. So hopefully it's been pretty well road tested. And can do what it needs to. It is a standardized methodology to assess overheating risk, and it does it by running a simulation based on 24-hour occupancy. And it sets a limit on the percentage of hours exceeding a target temperature, and also sets a limit on hours where the temperature will exceed, in theory, 26 degrees centigrade in bedrooms. So it's a pretty complex beast in itself. I don't claim to be an expert in it, and it's probably a topic for its own webinar in the future, maybe. If there's a demand, feel free to let us know if that's the sort of thing you want to see. I think I would probably bump that one onto my colleague Les Ryder, who is a bit of a boffin, and he loves stuff like that, and a far more intelligent man for doing that sort of a complex presentation. But I'll see if I can press gang him into doing that if it's required. So a usable strategy. Remember that clause 2A in the requirement 01, and it said that account must be taken of the occupant's safety and enjoyment of the residents. In other words, the strategy must be realistically usable and consider things like, as on the slide, noise at night. So windows may need to be closed at night because of noise, and there's guidance on noise limits in the approved document between the hours of 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. It's the sort of thing really that needs to be picked up at the planning stage, doesn't it? Because it has relevance to the the appearance and design of the building. There's also the consideration of noisy mechanical ventilation. It's a common problem, and it's covered in approved document F. So there's a cross-reference there. So many people, if they will turn the whole house mechanical ventilation system off if it's noisy, and they'll turn it off in the evening, and then air quality suffers accordingly. Pollution is also a consideration. Obviously, if the building is near significant pollution sources, then we need to consider guidance, which is in approved document F, and look at exposure limits. And there are tables on that in that approved document. And of course, that covers things like road traffic. That's going to be the main one, or industrial discharges occasionally might also have a bearing. And ADF also has guidance on measures to mitigate. So it does involve some sort of environmental testing and monitoring, so that you can see the sort of levels of pollution you're going to get and whether you need to mitigate with special measures. Moving on, security. For that, of course, we've got Part Q, an approved document Q of the building regulations, and that relates to ground floor and easily accessible bedrooms. There's no point in providing ventilation openings to a bedroom if it can't be left open at night and be secure. So the calculations for bedrooms will only consider areas of opening that can be used securely during nighttime hours. So by accessible, I'm talking about windows within 2 meters of an accessible level surface. As you'll know from approved document Q, that correlates with that. But also windows that are adjacent to low-pitched lean-to roofs that are themselves within 3.5 meters of ground level. So if you've got windows like that, then you have to incorporate some sort of guarding or restrictor to prevent anybody creeping into those bedrooms in the small hours. And finally, or not finally, penultimately, protection from falling. And we've got some rules, more stringent rules than Part K actually, relating to protection from falling. The reason we're given is that windows for cooling against solar gain may be open for longer periods, so are presenting a higher risk, hence the more onerous requirements, which I will show you on the next slide, I think. Yes, there it is. There's the diagram 3.1 in the document. You'll see there's two standards, one for where the change in floor level between inside and outside is less than 600 mil. And you'll see there it relates to, it cross-references and says see approved document K. In other words, follow the guidance in there. Well, as building control colleagues will know, level differences less than 600 mil in a dwelling house, there's no requirement to guard. However, in other residential buildings, maybe a care home or something like that, the level difference requiring guarding is 380 mil. So what the table is saying is, well, you just because Part O doesn't ask for guarding, Part K may. Where the level difference is more than 600 millimeters, then we've got this new, as I say, onerous requirement for guarding up to 1.1 meters if necessary. So if the sill of the window is less than 1.1, then you're going to have to put some sort of guard in there, or you're going to have to incorporate some sort of a restrictor to restrict the window from opening more than 100 millimeters, which of course then has ramifications for the geometric free area in calculating your ventilation provision. So that could cause a few problems. Currently, as you may know, Approved Document K, the requirement is 800 millimeters is the height minimum. So it's going to make a change, and also it may conflict with Part B requirements on means of escape windows, because there is a maximum sill level for an escape window of 1.1 meters. So there'll be a lot of windows with exactly that sill height, no doubt, to meet both requirements. The other point that's made in ADO is that handles should not project more than 650 mil from the inner face of the wall when the window's fully open. So they don't want people leaning out of these windows and toppling out, which seems to make sense. And finally, we've got protection from entrapment. Nice little slide there. Looks like a 1950s lad. Got his ear stuck through the railings. But there is a serious point there that shutters and railings can trap people and cause injury. So Part O says that these shutters and railings provided to create secure windows must be designed so that body parts don't become trapped in them. So they shouldn't allow the passage of a 100 millimeter diameter sphere, a 100 millimeter diameter sphere, should I say, even. All those little pin-headed children there with the tiny heads, we don't want them getting their head stuck. And also any hole more than 8 millimeters must be at least 25 millimeters and must not taper. So never mind heads, we don't want any fingers getting caught in there as well. Finally, looped cords must have child safety devices. Don't forget, it mentioned that blinds and shutters have to be external, but maybe you do get a few loop cords with those, and they need to be properly fitted so that nobody can cause themselves any strangulation issues by getting caught up in them. We're on the run-in now. I mentioned I was going to talk about Regulation 40B. This relates to information for owners, and there it is, the regulation itself applying to work where Part O applies, and it says that the person carrying out the work not later than 5 days after the work has been completed must give sufficient information to the owner about the provision made in accordance with Part O, so that the systems in place further to Part O can be operated in such a manner as to protect against overheating. Well, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? So there's no point in putting all these safety features in a building if the person who lives in the building is not really aware of the need to use them and use them properly for a safe and healthy environment. It's the same with things like ventilation. We know even totally compliant new dwellings have poor air quality, and simply for the reason that people don't use the fans and trickle vents and all the facilities that are put in there for their interest. And Part F now also has a requirement for a similar building user guide, so that people can read up and use them properly. In theory, of course, in truth, they probably still won't. I think the only way really to make buildings safe is to make them smart and automated, and so people don't have to think for themselves. But that's my cynical view. So there it is. That will be mandatory. It must be in a clear, non-technical format, so easy to digest, and it gives its best hope of being read and understood. And yeah, sorry, building control colleagues and designers, the paper chase that we have to go through, all that rigmarole on completion of a building, just got a little bit longer. There's some new forms that need to be filled in, not only by the designer, but also by the builder and also by the building control surveyor. And you see them there on the slide, parts 2B there, 2A and 2B, which should be filled in by the designer, depending on which method he's using to demonstrate compliance, the simple method or the dynamic method. But also there, part 3 needs to be completed by the builder, who has to make a declaration that he has constructed and completed in accordance with the specifications. And building control has to say that they've checked it and seen that it does comply. And the construction is consistent with the details provided in a checklist that will need to be completed. So there you go. Another thing that we have to watch out for on completion before we can release that all-important completion certificate. Right, well, glad to know this is the penultimate slide. And as I mentioned, I'll talk about the transitional provisions. So not long now, June 22nd, work not commenced, but with an application registered by June 22nd will not come under the new ADO, but it must commence within a year, in other words, prior to June 2023. Anything else, any applications submitted after June 2022 will come under ADO. And then from June 23, any work that's not started will definitely come under approved document O. So that commencement is all critical, and it's made clear that commencement does not, you can't just commence one unit on a development of say 100 houses and then get under the wire for part O. You have to, the requirement relates to each and every unit, so you have to apply it in that way and commence every unit. And what does constitute commencement? Well, something like digging a foundation would, preparation of the ground for a raft foundation, that would be regarded as a commencement. Laying drainage, also, yes, but something like just a site strip or demolition of an existing structure on the site would not constitute a commencement. So hopefully that's reasonably clear. And you know what you've got to do if you want to try and miss the regulations applying. So that's that. I hope that was useful and interesting. We've got a few minutes left. So Rachel, do you want to cut in and just tell me if there's any accumulated questions that you want to fire at me and see if you can catch me out?
Yeah, we have quite a few questions actually. We've raised, it's been a good session, so fire away. Where the approved document requires every single unit to be tested against TM59, is it acceptable to take a representative sample of units on larger schemes?
Yeah, good question. It'd be nice if you could do that. You know, sometimes with sound insulation that works, doesn't it? But unfortunately, the alignment of each building is critical. So I suppose in theory, in other words, alignment in relation to the sun. So in theory, if you had buildings with the facades aligned in the same way, and if they are identical buildings in layout and design, then yeah, you wouldn't need to calculate them twice because the data would be exactly the same and would come out with the same result. But unfortunately, on a typical residential estate, there'll all be lots of different alignments and different layouts and handy layouts, and so you probably wouldn't be able to benefit from that. So there you go. Hopefully that's relatively clear.
Thank you. Next one, because of the security and protection of falling, etc., I cannot see in dwellings and bungalows, etc., where there isn't a scenario where you wouldn't need to do the TM59 assessment. Could you advise on a scenario where you could actually use a simplified method of calculation?
Yeah, well, I think you could still use a simplified method, but you would have to take the look at the geometric free area that is provided, take into consideration whatever guarding or shuttering method you use. So I think you could still use it and relate to the tables, but you obviously guarding and shutters would have an effect on that you'd have to build into your calculation.
Okay, next one. Who would carry out the simplified method check, and how would this be linked to the design SAP calculation?
Good question. And a kind of astute observation there. Why doesn't it link to the SAP calculation? I was talking to my colleague, our major projects manager, Les Ryder, and his first comment was, well, why on earth did they not modify the SAP calculation to incorporate this and save a lot of palaver? Yeah, it could have been, couldn't it? But it wasn't. So it is a separate calculation. It's separate to the SAP. Who can do it? Well, it doesn't necessarily have to be a registered assessor of any sort. There's no qualification bar on anybody doing it. So it might be a consultant energy specialist, or it might be an architect or designer. It might be a householder. Yeah, it's anybody can have a go.
Okay, next one. Would this apply also to annexes associated with dwellings?
Yes, it would. Yeah, if an annex contains sleeping accommodation, you'd have to apply it separately. Yeah. Not if it's a gymnasium or some home office or something, then no. But I think the critical thing would be the sleeping accommodation.
So from a practical time perspective, is it expected that building control surveyors are going to carry out an in-depth check on all new dwelling submissions, with building notice applications, self-builds, particularly those with planning permission from before June the 22nd?
Right, yeah, interesting question. I can't answer for all my colleagues around the country. There's quite a few colleagues here today listening, so I won't try, or they'll be shouting at me. As always, building control surveyors take reasonable steps to ensure compliance, and it is down to the individual surveyor who's checking the scheme to decide to what extent he will go to do that. I would suggest that there would be relevance in who had presented the calculations. If it was a specialist, energy consultant or something like that, then we might look at them with a lighter touch than somebody having a go, a gifted amateur, where we'd be a bit more scrutinizing the data input and the method of calculation. So yeah, there's no fixed answer to that. Yeah, we would, it's sort of the dust has got to settle a bit, and we've got to work out how we are going to incorporate these new requirements into our checking processes, and decide to what extent we do run those numbers and make sure they're absolutely accurate, because it would be a hugely time-consuming thing to check the geometric free area of every window in a building, wouldn't it? My goodness me, it just doesn't seem feasible. So there you go. Maybe spot checks is the way to go. Colleagues around the country, do let me know what your thoughts are, and we'll put it out there.
Another one, would the new 1.1 metre guard height only apply to new dwellings? If not to extensions, would this lead to dual standards?
Well, there you go. Easy answer, because I think I mentioned that fortunately extensions aren't controlled. So yeah, no relevance to extensions, and thank goodness they're not.
Okay, do we know the reason behind signing extra forms, the thermodynamic form, to confirm compliance? Doesn't the issue of a completion certificate already confirm that we agree the building works comply?
Yeah, well, good point. With the new Building Act and coming in, there is a big onus on individuals taking responsibility It's not for building control to take responsibility for a design and a build. It's for the people who are designing it and for the people who are building it. So maybe in signing these documents, it's formalizing that responsibility. And then if there is any later scrutiny from the new national regulator, if something comes to light where it has to be investigated, then those signed statements will be of more relevance. I can only think that there may be something in the commentary when the document was out and out for consultation, but I'm afraid, top of my head, I can't remember. So it's a bit of a fudged answer, but there you go. Best I can do on the hoof.
Please give feedback on the use of restrictors on high-rise blocks and the effect on ventilation area.
Yeah, well, the restrictors is one method of making a safe opening for removing excess heat. However, obviously, it does restrict the geometric free area. You have to assume that restrictor is in place. So it does limit the amount of ventilation area you'll get from that window. So yeah, it's probably, you'll see a lot of that on flats, and there maybe need to be more windows.
Okay, final two questions. Would paragraph 3.6 bracket security generally rule out the use of bedroom windows for cooling in a new bungalow unless the builder developer is prepared to fix full height railings or shutters?
Yeah, in a bungalow, yeah, it's a good point. Yes, it's as simple as that, isn't it? They are going to be accessible windows, 2 bedrooms, so you've got to make them secure, and that's the only way you're going to do it, with some guardings or shutters which are ventilated.
And final question then, generally using the simplified method again, if a first floor bedroom has a single window, this should be 1.1 above FFL or fixed guarded. Yeah,
that's right. That is the new onerous requirement. If it's a first floor window, then you've got the risk you're over the 600 millimeters, obviously, so it has to be guarded. And the guarding height is the more onerous 1.1 meters, not the 800 millimeters that we've been living with for many years. Yeah, it's going to have an effect on design and cause some complications.
That's all the questions from the Q&A, Trevor. Thank you.
Excellent. Oh, well, thanks very much. In that case, we can conclude.
Yeah, we've got our next CPD coming up in July, and that will be with Strong Tie on July the 13th. So I'll be emailing everybody who's subscribed to HBC Communications. So that's great. But yeah, thank you, Trevor.
No, it's been a pleasure, and thanks for everybody for turning up. If you ever have any subjects of interest that you'd like us to cover, do let us know. And also, if you're quite new to these webinars, there is a library of past events recorded on our website, and you see the link to it there, our CPD event library. So we've done a few on other new regs such as Part L, and there'll be some more to come. So yeah, without further ado, we hope to see you again soon, and that you weren't bored rigid by the presentation. And we'll be in touch soon. Thanks very much.